Last time we spoke about Operation Nika, the invasion of Roha Province. In 1932, the Quangong Army eyed Roha Province as vital for Manchukuo's success. General Tang Yulin, ruling Roha, initially favored Japanese interests due to economic ties, particularly in opium. Tensions escalated after a Japanese civilian was abducted, prompting military actions that led to skirmishes in Shanhaiguan. Amidst the growing conflict, Jang Shang mobilized forces against Tang Yulin, who eventually conceded. As Japan prepared for invasion, both sides strategized, with Chiang Kai-shek reluctant to engage directly, fearing Japanese influence over his rivals. Operation Nika commenced, showcasing the Quangong Army's efficiency as they swiftly routed Chinese forces in Roha. By March the 4th, key passes were captured, but fierce resistance emerged. General Nishi faced counterattacks, leading to strategic retreats. Meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek struggled with internal conflicts while managing the Japanese threat. As the Quangong Army pushed beyond the Great Wall, logistical issues arose, prompting political maneuvers to secure local warlord alliances. However, plans faltered when Jang Chen Yao, potential ally, was assassinated. This episode is The Battle for the Great Wall of China. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more. Let's go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all of that, you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War, a newly titled podcast found on all major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I just released a long-form documentary covering the Boxer Rebellion and Russo-Japanese War. That documentary titled The Battle for Asia. Over on Echoes of War, we are now beginning a multi-part series covering the Malayan campaign of World War II. If you'd like to further support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. All of the funds from my Patreon and YouTube membership go to paying brand new animators I just hired. And rather ironically, their first episode, that is actually coming out quite soon, is on the Battle for the Great Wall of China, the very same subject we're tackling in this podcast today. To all of those who've already joined up, thank you a lot, and for those who might be interested, please give it a look. In the previous episode, Operation Nika had been unleashed. The Quangong Army tossed 2 divisions into Roha Province with the intent of forcing its annexation into Manchukuo. They were under strict orders to not extend operations past the Great Wall of China. However, they believed it was necessary to seize the main gateways along the Great Wall of China to establish their new borders, and in order to do so, this absolutely required they go past them. Yet military operations were not the only means of securing said goals. The Japanese forces faced significant logistical challenges, including a shortage of troops, having advanced into Roha with only 20,000 men. Even the most resolute general in the Quangong Army doubted that their military strength could prevail against the vast numbers of Chinese troops in the plains of Hubei. As a result, they needed to supplement their military efforts with political strategies targeting regional warlords. The tactic of bribing local elites had proven highly effective during the pacification of Manchuria, and there was no reason to think it wouldn't work in North China as well. All these actions were carried out without any oversight from Tokyo HQ. On February the 13th of 1933, Itagaki Seishiro, whom at that time was head of the Mukden Special Service Agency, was transferred to the general staff without any formal announcement of his promotion. He took up a position in Tianjin, specifically to initiate political maneuvers in eastern Hubei, leading to the establishment of the Tianjin Special Service Agency. Initially, this agency sought to engage various competing warlords in North China, including Duan Qire, Wu Peifu, and Sun Chuanfeng, but eventually they focused on Jang Chen Yao. Jang Chen Yao had previously been a protege of Duan Qide, serving as the civil and military governor of Henan province. He had fought against Jang Yulin in 1925 before shifting his allegiance to Wu Peifu. During the second phase of the northern expedition, Jang Chen Yao had battled Jang Yulin again, who was then in control of the National Pacification Army. After the northern expedition concluded, he allied with Yan Qishan's forces in Shanxi. So yeah, it would seem he was a man of no principles nor loyalties of any kind. The Tianjin Special Service Agency initially aimed to approach Jang Chen Yao in the hopes that he could orchestrate a coup d'etat against Chiang Kai-shek. They also hoped to persuade other figures such as Song Chen-yuan, Jiang Zhuoxiang, Fang Qianwu, Xu Yusan, Zhang Qingshi, Sun Tingying, and Feng Zhenghai. If successful, this could lead to a swift takeover of North China, as they were advancing towards Beiping after taking the Great Wall. However, on May the 7th, Jang Chen Yao was assassinated, completely derailing these plans. With Jang Chen Yao dead, the agency concentrated their efforts instead to instigate riots in the Beiping-Tianjin region. They also began encouraging and propping up new political organizations that sought to form an independent northern regime. One scheme they were performing was to form a committee composed of northern warlords headed by Liu Zhangyu, a banker who had studied in Japan. The idea was to form an anti-Chiang Kai-shek coalition to carve out North China. The agency received a significant amount of funds to make ends meet. Itagaki alone would spend over 50,000 yen to try and bring about an anti-Chiang regime in the north. Some sources indicate over 3 billion yen had been allocated to the IJA to be dished out to various Chinese warlords and elites in the form of bribes. Meanwhile, operations in the district east of the Luan River saw attacks formed against Xuemenjai and Longkao gateways. On April 1st, the Quangong Army issued Order 491, seeing the Iwata detachment of the IJ's 6th Division storm through the Xuemenjai gate and succeed in securing a supply route behind the Great Wall to help with assaults against other gateways in the region. By April 10th, the IJ's 6th Division was making steady progress against the Longkao Gate. The next day, they stormed through and captured Jianchanying, pursuing the retreating Chinese to the banks of the Luan River. Meanwhile, the IJ's 8th Division were facing a much more difficult situation. On the 12th, they had captured Shifengkou, but their assault against Chulingkou was going nowhere. After repeated assaults, the Chinese finally retreated, allowing the Japanese to focus on Taitaoying. Thus, from the 10th to the 23rd, the gateways in northeastern Hubei were really falling into Japanese hands. The Kawahara Brigade was well on its way towards Nansanmen. The operations within the Great Wall area had been fully authorized by Generals Nishi and Sakimoto. However, there still existed limits upon said operations. For example, Operation Order 495 issued by General Muto, given on the 11th, stated this: "Without specific orders, pursuit by the main force of ground troops is to be limited to the line connecting Hutong, Zhenjiang, and Taitoying, but air units are to be limited to the Luan River." Meanwhile, the Special Service Agency in Tianjin had reported that Jang Chen Yao would stage a coup on the 21st, and this prompted Song Chuyuan's troops to prevent the Central Army forces from fleeing towards Beiping. The agency requested that the Quangong Army not return to the Great Wall and instead perform a feint attack towards Beiping and Tianjin to scare the Chinese. As the plot was reaching its climax, on the 18th, the Quangong Army Chief of Staff, General Gozo Kunaki, issued an order for the 8th Division to strike in full force against the Gubeikou area. The Quangong Army's plan was to bomb Miyun while launching their feint attack in combination with an all-out effort to break Gubeikou. However, on the night of the 18th, all of these plans changed dramatically. Suddenly, General Muto issued Operations Order 498, hastily ordering all forces to withdraw to the Great Wall. Emperor Hirohito had decided to put his foot down. In Tokyo, the emperor asked his Vice Chief of General Staff, Lieutenant General Misaki Jintaburo, "Has the Quangong Army withdrawn from the Luan River line?" The Vice Chief retired from the imperial presence with a sense of guilt and wrote a confidential letter to the commander of the Quangong Army. It was personally carried by Infantry Captain Keito Michio of the General Staff, who on April 19th arrived at the capital of Manchukuo, bearing an imperial rescript. The Vice Chief also cabled to the Chief of Staff of the Quangong Army a highly confidential dispatch, the main point of which stated, "Withdraw your troops immediately, or imperial command will be issued." Thereupon the chief of staff of the Quangong Army directed the staff officer, Endo Saburo, to draft the withdrawal order. Thus, as a result, the Quangong Army began a withdrawal on the 21st, the same day the Beiping coup was to be unleashed. Those around Emperor Hirohito at this time had gone on the record to state it seemed to them the emperor had hesitated heavily on issuing the withdrawal orders. His motivations for giving the order are simple. The Quangong Army had gone against his decrees. It was an identical situation to what had happened at Mukden in 1931. The Quangong Army had no choice but to submit to what essentially was him asking them to stop. With that, operations east of the Yuan River were over for now. The order was certainly a critical blow to the agency in Tientsin. How did they react? They doubled down on their coup effort. Likewise, Koso did not stop the 8th Division's operations at Gubeikou. Instead, the 8th Division was given orders to, quote, "maintain a menacing attitude towards hostile forces in North China." In accordance, the 3,800-man Kawahara Brigade, on direct orders from General Nishi, launched an attack against 2 Central Army divisions numbering nearly 30,000 men stationed at Nansanmen. After a brutal week of battle, the Kawahara Brigade seized the town. Meanwhile, a battalion of 280 men, led by Colonel Shimura Iejiro, attacked a Central Army force of around 4,000 men at Xinglong. They suffered a 38% rate of casualties by the night of the 27th. The battalion was nearly annihilated when suddenly the Chinese withdrew, enabling the Japanese to slip by. Meanwhile, the Beiping coup did not materialize as planned on the 21st. Instead, a secondary coup was initiated by Jang Shang on the 26th, but this misfired greatly. Reports began to emerge that troops led by Jiang Zingshu, Sun Tinying, Fang Jianghai, and Xu Yusan were willing to rebel in response to the failed coup attempts, but this proved completely false. A report issued on the 30th stated troops under Fang Chengwu were rebelling against Chiang Kai-shek. However, in reality, Fang Chengwu only advanced his force north on May the 10th, and it was to join the anti-Japanese forces. From mid-April to mid-May, the United States, Britain, France, and Germany finally entered the fray in North China. It was an extremely chaotic situation for everyone. The Japanese military in Tokyo had no control nor idea what the Quangong Army was doing, so when they tried to explain their actions to the international community, they continuously were walking over ranks. All the talk from Tokyo seemed incomprehensible to the other great powers. The Chinese were clamoring the entire time for a ceasefire agreement, but lacked the means to force the Japanese to do so. Japan had left the League of Nations and thus was extremely isolated and insecure in regards to the foreign relations. Thus, if a nation like Britain or the United States had actually put their foot down, the Japanese more than likely would have backed off. Another element to this debacle was the stance of the Imperial Japanese Navy, who had made it adamantly clear they had zero intention of fighting off the British or Americans because of their unruly siblings within the army. However, both Britain and America were too preoccupied with internal strife, mostly as a result of the Great Depression, to devote considerable efforts to the crisis in China. The League of Nations remained completely useless during the North China incident, similarly to how they were useless with the Manchurian incident. The Lin Commission had performed an on-spot inquiry and did play a role in establishing a ceasefire by the time of the Shanghai incident, but did really nothing to help China. China began appealing to the League when Shanaguan was attacked, and this prompted the nations of the League to rapidly agree to the Lin Commission's report and its recommendations. In turn, this led Matsuoka Yosuke to walk out of the League. With Japan out of the League, Wellington Coup proposed harsh sanctions upon Japan in response to their invasion of Roha Province. Yet they did nothing. China would continuously make pleas, but it was to no avail. Rather than rely upon the League of Nations, the Chinese began secret talks with the Japanese, aiming for a ceasefire. Tang Yulin, Li Zhejiang, and Wang Guomin attempted talks, but failed. Then Chen Yi, the political vice minister of military affairs, secretly spoke with Nomoto Hiroshi, an army attaché at Shanghai's legation, on the 27th of April. They established negotiations with Nomoto speaking on behalf of the Quangong Army and Chen Yi on behalf of Hu Yingqin. The Chinese were clearly more eager than the Japanese for a ceasefire, but the Japanese no longer had a rationale for continuing their operation. Regardless, the Japanese took the victor's stance and demanded the Chinese withdraw from the battlefield as a prerequisite to further Japanese advances. In the first meeting, Nomoto told Chen that the Quangong Army had already withdrawn from the area east of the Han River to give Hu Yingqin an opportunity to consider a ceasefire. He described the action as a friendly gesture and suggested the Chinese reciprocate it by withdrawing their own troops. Chen Yi countered this by claiming Hu Yingqin had shown his own sincerity at the Battle of Nansen-men by ordering his troops to withdraw to a second line of defense, hoping this would allow the Japanese to pull away from Nansen-men. However, by May the 1st, the Japanese claimed they had captured and secured Nansen-men, so Nomoto informed Chen Yi that Chinese forces north of the Great Wall should withdraw to a line connecting Miyun, Piankou, Yutian, and the Luan River. On May the 2nd, the Chinese sent a reply to this, completely ignoring the line idea, and instead referred to the recent battle of Xinglong and explained the local commander there was eager for a victory and refused to withdraw despite being asked twice to do so. The Chinese also notified Nomoto that a political affairs council headed by Huang Fu was being established at Beiping and that it should be through that body that further negotiations were held. The Japanese welcomed this development. Just as it seemed the Shanghai talks were paving a way to a ceasefire, the leadership of the Quangong Army abandoned their political maneuvers in favor of a settlement. On April the 30th, the Tientsin Special Service Agency insisted to their Japanese colleagues the Chinese were just buying time and not sincere in their actions. That same day, the Army General Staff and Foreign Ministry suddenly refused to initiate a ceasefire on the grounds the Chinese had agreed to an armistice only to save face. Lieutenant Colonel Nagatsu Sahashige, the army attaché to Beiping, urged the 8th Division to rapidly strike southwards as far as Miyun to annihilate Hu Yingqin's planned counteroffensive. Such an action would immediately threaten the Beiping-Tientsin region. To push the envelope, the Japanese could toss a new division into the mix and force further negotiations when the Chinese withdrew south of Miyun. Clearly, the Japanese had their eyes set on Miyun now. As such, General Nishi was secretly told to capture it without any direction from Tokyo HQ, nor from most Quangong Army leadership. The Operations Department of the Quangong Army also independently elected to move troops east of the Luan River. They argued, "The enemy again advances east of the Luan River and persists in defiant attitude. Therefore, we must again deal them a crushing blow." The IJ 6th Division had been evacuated to the Great Wall back on April the 23rd, and along the way were closely pursued by Chinese forces. General Sakamoto sent a plan to the Quangong Army headquarters stating, "To again drive the enemy west of the Luan River." Now, a lot of chaos was reigning within the Japanese military because they were in echo chambers and not relaying information to another. When the Quangong Army Operations Department suddenly proposed a new advance east of the Luan River, on May the 2nd, a heated exchange took place between them and the Quangong Army Intelligence Section. What I'm about to read to you is a transcript of that. Intelligence Section. The defiant attitude of the enemy is a matter of degree. While it is indisputable that some of their forces continue defiance, their main force is still stationed west of the Luan River. Therefore, a defiant attitude on the part of the enemy is not sufficient reason to deal them a crushing blow. The Quangong Army withdrew from the Luan River only 10 days ago. As we understand it, the purpose was to comply with the imperial wish. If the army begins operations on a flimsy pretext at this time, inviting intervention by the central leadership, how can the honor of the commander-in-chief be maintained? What we should now attack are, rather, the enemy forces facing the 8th Division. For this, we should employ additional strength. By dealing a severe blow to the Chinese Central Army forces in the area, we can threaten Beiping, and the operation should be all the more effective. Operations Section. Due to the limitations of our supply capacity, we cannot use more than a certain level of forces against the enemy facing the 8th Division. Since the enemy east of the Luan River maintains a defiant attitude, they must be punished regardless of their strength. Intelligence Section. Since the seizure of Nansen-men, the 8th Division lacks the capability of pursuing the enemy. This is an unavoidable consequence of the small strength of its force from the offset of the operation. Isn't the 1st Operations Section uncertain that the enemy can be defeated even by the main force of the 8th Division? And doesn't it intend ultimately to deploy the 6th Division southward, in concert with the action of the 8th Division? If this is the case, it is understandable, and this section is not necessarily against it. Operations Section. This is not what this section is considering. Intelligence section. In that case, there is no clear justification for launching the operation. The objective of the operation must be plainly spelled out to all concerned, from His Majesty, at the top down to the lowest private. There must not be the slightest doubt about it. Now, after this conversation, the intelligence department debated amongst themselves before reeling another response at midnight, ultimately not approving it. The next day, the operations department sent a telegram to the negotiation teams in Beiping. This is that telegram. Number 1. Under present conditions, the Quangong Army has no intention of accepting a ceasefire proposal for the time being, particularly because there are signs suggesting intervention by third countries in the matter. Number 2. Previously, the Quangong Army suggested the Miyun-Yutianlan River line as the retreat line for the Chinese army, but this did not mean it was to be their front line after a ceasefire. It rather indicated a line to which the Japanese army should immediately and voluntarily retreat as evidence of their sincerity. In other words, ceasefire cannot be negotiated until they retreat to this line and abandon their provocative attitude, and until this is confirmed by the Quangong Army. Their mere retreat to the indicated line in today's circumstances is not sufficient reason for us to respond to a ceasefire proposal. According to Peking Telegram 483, it appears that the intentions of our army have been somewhat misunderstood. Even if the Chinese retreat to the indicated line and display the sincerity of their intentions, we may possibly demand a retreat line even further south. We believe negotiations in this region should be handled by the central leadership in Tokyo, rather than by the Quangong Army. Act on this understanding. So after this message, the intelligence department accused the operations department of trying to find any excuse to renew their advance, and they sent a wire to Nomoto on April the 29th. If the Chinese suddenly perceive their mistake, we will not make war for the fun of it. However, the intelligence department was suddenly overruled by Colonel Kita, who cabled the negotiators that the operations department now had full approval from the Quangong Army Vice Chief of Staff, Okamoto Yusuji. When General Muto received this notice, he questioned. This draft order states that the enemy has moved into the region east of the Lan River and is showing a provocative attitude. I did not receive such a report from the 2nd Intelligence Section before my departure from Huxing. Does this mean there has been a subsequent change in the situation? After being informed more so, Muto simply stated he wished to wait until the Chief of Staff could speak to him. Obviously, Muto was getting wet feet and did not want to perform any actions not in accordance with Tokyo HQ, as Emperor Hirohito had put his foot down. On May the 3rd, General Koizo and the Operations Department staff officer, Endo Saburo, spoke with Muto, indicating they had approval of Tokyo HQ, the General Staff, and even the Emperor. So Muto relented for a second advance, and he issued Order 503 on May the 3rd to the IJ 6th and 8th Divisions. Now the Army General Staff were dragged into the Quangong Army's debacle fully, so they drew up an emergency draft plan for measures in North China, and it was to this aim. Through continuing pressure by the military might of the Quangong Army, applied in concert with various political measures in North China, the Chinese forces in North China are to be compelled to make a substantial surrender or to dissolve, thereby resulting in the withdrawal of the Chinese army along the China-Manchukuo border and in the establishment of peace in this area. Added to this, the General Staff suggested a large counteroffensive be driven along the Great Wall, and a formal truce agreement should be concluded once 3 conditions have been met. Condition A. That Chinese forces have retreated voluntarily south and west of the line connecting Hushua, Shenyu, Sanhou, Yutian, Longzhou, and Luoting. Condition B. That anti-Japanese activities have been controlled. And Condition C. That the proceeding have been verified by the Japanese armed forces. Under immense pressure from the renewed Japanese advance, the Chinese government on May the 3rd had pushed for a new body to tackle the North China situation. That was the Beiping Political Affairs Council. It was composed of 22 members headed by Huang Fu. Huang Fu was notably a pro-Japanese official, having been a graduate of the Tokyo Land Survey Department Training Institute, and he had served earlier as a Minister of Foreign Affairs. Since China had zero faith anymore in the League of Nations, and they believed if they failed to resolve the North China issue, this all might see a new civil war break out between Chiang Kai-shek and Wang Jingwei. Thus, everyone felt that this time for active resistance was over, and that they must all place their efforts in negotiations. Chiang Kai-shek placed a great amount of authority upon Huang Fu, and he trusted the man. Wang Fu began this new task by speaking with all the political and financial leaders from both sides of the conflict to see how a real ceasefire could be met through deal-making. Meanwhile, on May the 6th, the IJ-6 Division unleashed a new offensive south of the Great Wall, and they were followed by the 8th Division on the 11th. General Muto at this time made a public statement blaming the Chinese for the renewed hostilities, making it seem the Japanese had intended to stay within the Great Wall area. The 6th Division swept across the sector east of the Luan River, and by the 11th, the Chinese defensive line collapsed. On the 12th, the 6th Division crossed the Luan River, pursuing Yu Shichang's 51st Army, and in turn, this threatened Hu Yingqin's main force, who were facing the 8th Division. In the previous battles, Yu Shichang's men had performed quite poorly, and now even under the direct command of Hu Yingqin were proving themselves helpless against the 6th Division. Additionally, Itagaki's agency over in Tientsin were using radio facilities to dispatch false directives from Chinese high command, ordering the forces to retreat from the front battle line. 2 to 3 Chinese divisions were neutralized by these fake radio messages, and in turn the Chinese became very demoralized at their lines. The 8th Division had driven into the Gubeikou area on the 11th, and it took them only a day to dislodge the Chinese from their line near Shishachen. By the 13th, Shishachen had fallen completely. On the 11th and 12th, the Japanese aircraft began flying over Beiping, as a demonstration of the terror they could deliver to the city at any moment. These developments altogether were pushing the Chinese civilians to demand of their politicians and generals that they appease the Japanese. Wang Fu proposed to Demoto on the 12th that all Chinese troops could be withdrawn from Miyun to a line extending from Shanyu to Yuzhen and Tangshan. This was an enormous concession, and nearly mirrored the line the Japanese had demanded. The Japanese, however, rejected this concession. To make matters even worse for the Chinese, Hu Yingqin had been notified of a large concession proposal in advance, and he expected the Japanese to take it. Thus, he had refrained from operating in strength at Miyun and did not significantly defend the path towards Beiping. It was the belief of the Japanese commanders, if they performed a full-scale attack towards Beiping now, Hu Yingqin would have no choice but to withdraw towards Shanyu. With this in mind, the Japanese made a proposal on the 14th. Number 1. In accordance to the reports of the Beiping military attaché, the 8th Division should be prepared to advance in a single sweep to the southern limit of Miyun. If it is deemed necessary, preparations for this attack should be expedited. Number 2. In conjunction with the above, frontline aircraft should take actions implying that a major Japanese offensive is about to begin. Number 3. In Tokyo, it should be announced publicly, in liaison with the Foreign Ministry, that the security of Roha Province cannot be guaranteed as long as the Chinese army remains in Miyun. Furthermore, every so often, Japanese aircraft should make demonstration flights over the Shanyu-Tongzhou area. Confronted with this, the Chinese were pretty scared. The Chinese negotiation teams were frantically searching for any way to force a ceasefire. Then the secretary of the Shanghai legation, Suma Yakichiro, showed up to Beiping, which the Chinese viewed as a golden opportunity. The Chinese complained to him that the Quangong Army had resumed their offensive, and that a political agency working out of Tientsin were trying to enact a coup. Suma bluntly told them the Japanese actions were backed fully by Tokyo, and despite the Chinese belief that this was false, or that Japan was facing a major financial deficit, this was all untrue. While the dialogue continued to go nowhere, the 6th Division had pursued the Chinese forces to the vicinity of Fongjun. Muto believed that this had gone too far, so he issued orders on May the 13th, limiting operations to the area north of the line connecting Miyun, Pingkou, Fongjun, and Yongping. Now the 6th and 8th Divisions were to assemble around Shishachen and Sunhua. 2 days later, he issued this statement to the public. If the Chinese army immediately abandons its hitherto provocative attitude and withdraws some distance from the border, our army will quickly return to the line of the Great Wall and pursue its regular task of maintaining security in Manchukuo. Likewise, Muto ordered the Tientsin group to inform the Chinese that the Quangong Army would return to the Great Wall if the Chinese forces retreated to the Shanyu-Yuzhen-Tangshan line. Nemoto forwarded all of this to Chen Yi. On May the 15th, Hu Yingqin ordered the withdrawal of the Chinese forces to a line between Malinyu, Lelancang, and Pamanchong. With what seemed an imminent ceasefire at hand, the Quangong Army HQ ordered the 6th and 8th Divisions to take up positions strategically favorable for the negotiations to finally begin in earnest. On the 17th, a draft ceasefire plan was drawn up. It envisioned the withdrawal of the Chinese forces to the Shanyu-Yuzhen-Tangshan line and in return the Japanese would pull back to the Great Wall area. Huang Fu, on his way back to Beiping from Shanghai, for the probably 10th time in 2 weeks. Well, during this time the Japanese captured Fengjun and Zunhua, routing the Chinese across the Qi Canal to the right bank of the Pai River. The 6th Division then advanced towards Yutian and Chumenchan, and the 8th Division stood around Xixiqian. When the Chinese began retreating from Miyun on May the 18th, the 8th Division suddenly converged upon Miyun. Muto was, of course, delighted by their new advantageous position and even briefly began talking to his colleagues about the prospect of just marching upon Beiping. Instead, he decided to sweep through Miyun, Pingkou, and the Qi Canal, going even further west than he had stated he would back on the 13th. With these new orders in hand, the 6th Division quickly captured Xixian on the 19th and further pursued the retreating Chinese forces to Sanhou. The 8th Division entered Miyun and 2 days later began advancing to Huaizhou. By the 23rd, Huaizhou had fallen as the 6th Division reached the Qi Canal. These advances threatened the Beiping-Tianjin region. Both Japanese divisions halted on the 25th as the ceasefire was issued. Meanwhile, Itagaki's team at Tianjin were still trying to bring about a coup. In tandem with the 8th Division's attack on Miyun, the agency tried to engineer a revolt by militia troops led by Song Chenyuan, Fang Chenwu, Sun Qinying, amongst many others. The idea was for those forces to occupy Beiping while wreaking havoc upon the Chinese Central Army within the region. The agency had attempted recruiting Wu Peifu, but the old Jade Marshal was unwilling, so they turned to his former protege, the chairman of Hubei, Yu Shicheng. However, he also declined. Yu Shicheng was also approached by Hu Hanmin, looking to form an anti-Chiang Kai-shek campaign in cooperation with Han Fuku and Feng Yusang. To this, Yu Shicheng declined as well. Itagaki kept searching for disgruntled warlords, and then he turned to Li Qiashan and Xu Yusan. Yu Shusan was a former ally to Feng Yusang with a history of anti-Chiang actions. If they got the backing of his personal army, roughly 10,000 men strong at Tangshan, they could do some real damage. On May the 16th, Xu Yusan declared independence and then took up the Manchukuo 5-color flag in direct opposition of the Kuomintang. He began issuing the slogan, "Hubei for the people of Hubei," as his army marched west along the Beiping-Shanaguan Railway. His force reached the vicinity of Tanggu, whereupon they had increased to about 30,000, and rumors emerged they would occupy Tianjin. This began a massive panic, for literally a day. His army collapsed into nothing more than a rabble, and they had no stomach to actually fight their fellow countrymen. Despite this grand failure, the Tianjin group continued with other plots. At 8 p.m. on May the 19th, a Beiping-bound train from Tanggu carrying Chinese soldiers was bombed around the Tianjin station. The Japanese just love bombing trains, as we know. This resulted in small incidents involving Japanese and Chinese officials, giving a precedent for 600 Japanese troops led by Lieutenant General Takemura Kotaro to reinforce Tianjin on May the 23rd. There were a few other incidents where supposedly Chinese agents were tossing grenades at Japanese officials. One of these officials was Major Mori Takeshi of the Japanese Army General Staff, who was working in Tianjin. However, the grenade thrown at him was a dud, and before the Japanese could seize it, some local Chinese grabbed it to find a stamp on it bearing Tokyo Artillery Arsenal. Big oops. These numerous incidents influenced the Chinese, who feared Japan was trying to force an invasion of North China. To these rumors, Hu Yingqin insisted they mount a proper defense of Beiping, but many were arguing they had to further retreat. Meanwhile, the Tianjin agency was told to stop performing incidents and instead secure northern warlords for a future cause. I would like to take this time to remind all of you this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube to help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you give my personal channel a look over at the Pacific War channel on YouTube and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I just released a long-form documentary covering the Boxer Rebellion and Russo-Japanese War, titled The Fight for Asia. And over on Echoes of War, we are now releasing a brand new series covering the Malayan campaign of World War II. And hey, if you'd like to further support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. The latest exclusive podcast is a alternate history episode, the first in a multi-part series covering a alternate history of the Pacific War. The first episode is titled The Great Naval Battle of Pearl Harbor. Go check it out. The battle for the Great Wall of China was coming to a bitter end for the Chinese forces. The Japanese were using every deceptive measure to edge further and further into China proper. It seemed clear to the Chinese nothing would stop Japanese encroachment upon their nation, while the rest of the world simply watched on, doing nothing.